are having people joining in. Very nice. So maybe we just wait just 1 minute for people to join in, and then we can start our meeting, our conversations about child victims and in criminal proceedings and needs assessments. I would say, Rebecca, should we start? Yes? Okay, so welcome, welcome everyone. On behalf of Terre des Hommes in Europe and our partners in the Focus Project, Child Circle, SAPI Bulgaria, Child Rights Circle, Child Rights Center in Serbia, Defense for Children in the Netherlands. We are very happy to host you today for this series of 2 webinars that we are organizing. It's a series of webinars that is called In Uncertain Times. How are the needs of children assessed and considered in criminal proceedings? So I'm very pleased today to have an interdisciplinary panel to have this online conversation. More than a webinar, this is really a conversation that we invited you to take part in, and to listen a bit to an exchange between various practitioners that have encountered themselves in their practice some challenges currently during COVID-19 in this pandemic time that we are all going through. And so we would like to today focus on the situation of child victims. And before we go more in depth and we start with our full program, just a technical aspect is that you will be able to ask questions through the chat. The microphones have been deactivated for also the quality of sound sometimes gets affected. So we invite you to use the chat to ask your questions or to make your comments. We love receiving comments from people in the chat so that we can take it also to the panelists and have them answering the questions that you might have. And also just to mention to you that this webinar, this conversation is recorded, and we hope that it's okay with you. This will be as part of the series of also Child Hub webinars that we organize. This will be then put online on the Child Hub website. So for some of your colleagues or people that you know might be interested in joining, they will be able to listen to this conversation afterwards. We will send a link to this recording. So we will today go through different points, different questions related to this. How can we today, during a very critical time and uncertain time, assess the needs of child victims? And we have, in order to start with this conversation, we thought of giving the possibility a bit to tell you a bit about our focus project and also about what our individual needs assessment. So we will have Rebecca from Child Circle, our partner in Focus, to give you a few words, and then Sylvia, one of our experts and in-house consultant with the TDH, with the Terre des Hommes Europe, to actually explain what has been the work so far and that is being done, and how this actually webinar today enters also in how it will help to feed some of the work that will be done in the next year of the project. So Rebecca, I'll give you the floor to tell us a bit about assessments.
Good. Well, I mean, this is going to be quick, but we think it's useful to kind of start from the beginning. That justice, of course, needs to be child sensitive and child centered. And this might require, when a child is involved in a criminal proceeding as a victim of violence, that there are particular support measures in place for them, like information, interpretation in some cases, that there are protection measures put in place to respond to the violence against them, the crimes against them. They may need access to therapeutic or health services. And of course, during the criminal investigation itself or at the court hearings, special measures may need to be put in place, like not having the child in the court recording the interview. And many of those kinds of issues are addressed in EU law, in the Victims' Rights Directive and the Child Sexual Abuse Directive. So, I mean, we all know on this call that different professionals and services are involved in responding to those needs of the children. And what's involved in each case really depends on the individual case itself, on the circumstances of the child. So there's an obligation under EU law, and as it's reflected in national law, to carry out an individual needs assessment, so that we look at each child's circumstance and involve the child in understanding their circumstance. Now, Sylvia will say more about this in a moment, but in the Focus project, we've been looking at a little bit at how this is done across Europe. And there are very different ways of doing it, very different people involved. Frankly, it may not always happen, particularly when we're looking not at child victims, but at child suspects or accused. The call today, we focus on child victims, and next week we'll look to the situation for child suspects and accused. So sometimes we've seen that the process is entirely police-led, and it kind of starts with the report to the police, and it's focused largely on the criminal investigation and court proceeding. Sometimes it may be led by social services when they're responding to the child's needs, and then what they learn feeds into the criminal proceedings. And sometimes there's really an effort to have what we call an under one roof interagency approach, like the Barnahus model, and that brings services together so that we can kind of coordinate the needs of the criminal justice proceedings on the one hand and the child welfare system on the other, including the child's needs for therapeutic services where that arises. So in short, who does the assessment and how it's done is very different. And within the Focus project, we're not coming up with one model, but rather looking at sharing practice and identifying the kind of the standards we think should be in place. And as I said, Sylvia will take us through what we're doing there. But kind of in a nutshell, we see individual assessments as a process. It's never going to be a one-off moment. It's never going to be, or it shouldn't be a one-off moment. It shouldn't be a tick-the-box exercise. And at its best, it will involve a case management approach to really look at the child and their situation and engage with them and adapt the process to them and meet their needs. So there are lots of issues, lots of challenges, lots of opportunity for progress, because precisely if we stop and look at what a child needs, what a child wants, what being involved in a criminal proceeding means for their life, we may be able to avoid further trauma. We may be able to make sure they have access to their support they need. And of course, today our focus is on how the COVID situation has affected the situation of children and our ability to see them, hear them, understand what's going on. So that's an introductory word, and over to Sylvia.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this introduction. And it's indeed when we had, I mean, now we have been more than a year discussing about this, and every time we're coming indeed about, is there one definition, is there one model, and we feel like we want to be pushed to come up with this one model, and we realize that this is all about the bit of the diversity of this. And I really like what you're saying about the fact that this is a process, because we also live it ourselves as a process. And I think what you will present also, Sylvia, in a few words, and then the piloting during the Focus will help us also better define, because we understand also that the EU directive doesn't really give a very well definition of how you should actually implement it. And this is what we are trying to figure out in the Focus project. So to you, Sylvia, maybe if you could say a few words to the participants today about what Focus is and what you have reached so far.
Okay, thank you, Mariama. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, indeed, what I will try to do in these few minutes is to condense all what we have done in this first year of Focus, which is quite a hard task, because as you said, it was a complex, challenging, but still very, I think, very enriching and very fruitful process that we've been so far. So I'll try to share with the participants some few key steps that we conducted so far, and what is going to happen, what is happening now, and what is going to happen in the next year. So basically, it's a 2 years project. It's co-funded by the European Union, and so the first year of this, the first steps that of the focus project were basically consisted in a mapping exercise. So mostly we asked our focal points in the countries that you mentioned, Mariama, in the 5 countries, to provide us with a national review of the state of play in the local state of play for what concerns individual assessments with children in contact with the law. And in parallel, we conducted a European review. With the European review, as Rebecca was already mentioning, we mean like a sort of a mapping, of course, of some European and non-European projects that we also reached out to, some research initiatives that aimed at implementing and researching indeed a multidisciplinary needs assessment with child victims and child suspects or accused. And the main aim of this review was to identify some key key regional learnings, and to create synergies between projects, ongoing projects and initiatives. And that's, I think, also this webinar and next week's webinar is one of the results of this process. So among others, the main takeaway of this review of this mapping is, of course, that exactly multidisciplinary needs assessment practices are indeed gaining more and more relevance since the EU directives on victims' rights and procedural safeguards have been issued, but also the implementation of individual assessments, both for child victims and child suspects, still lack harmonized guidelines, standards, and some training and monitoring principles. So that's why we thought, as mentioned, that the first step for us necessary in the focus project was to develop some standards for individual assessment, as we don't want and we don't have the we didn't really find, and we think there is not like a best practice, a best model where we want to really implement. So we've been developing, elaborating these standards. Standards that national individual assessment processes should fulfill, regardless of the different approaches used in different countries. For each standard, we identified some rationale behind the indicators showing ways in which the standards might be fulfilled, and resources, of course, to use. All these instruments, these standards, together with the package, is definitely going to be one of the key also element in the capacity building package that we been developing also in this year, and now we are in the phase of finalizing. And also this capacity building packages will address a multidisciplinary team of professionals from the 5 implementing countries. And so the methodology will be a train the trainers methodology. So we've been developing a training handbook based on the findings that we collected so far. And this handbook is also going to be enriched and supported by what we call an online learning environment that is going to be created to support professionals during the training and the successive phase of piloting. So it's an online, I won't go into details, but it's an online learning environment where a professional will be able to share and consult resources. Towards the end of the project, also this training handbook and materials will be developed into e-learning modules. So basically also improved thanks to the lessons learned throughout the project, and will be accessible to all of you, all professionals from Europe, across Europe. So after the training phase, so we go back to the next phase of focus project, is the piloting phase. So we consider actually the training as the first step into the piloting. So is a crucial part of the piloting, where professionals will be provided with some main practical tools. So we just mentioned some that we've been developing, some mapping tool for professionals, checklists for practical considerations to reflect upon when developing an individual assessment practice, an inventory of noteworthy tools, or practitioner self-assessment tool where the practitioners can indeed assess their own reality in their own country on how individual assessment is put in practice. And finally, as a final step, so I tried to really condense all this work that is was quite intense and is going to be intense, but this webinar also is going to feed, as Mariama said at the beginning, to feed into all these tools that we are producing, and certainly all these standards and the training material and the review and the tools I mentioned will be collected and gathered in a unique document that is we are going to call mutual learning document. So there will be really some and a toolkit, a source of resource for practitioners and professionals for the future, and for all the professionals that work with children in contact with the law and want to either improve the individual assessments practice already existing, or even piloting new practices in their own context. So, and then I think yeah, that's all I wanted to share about the focus process.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And indeed, there is a lot to say about it, but you very nicely in 5 minutes summarizes what are the different tools. The beauty of the European project, and this is why we're very grateful for this co-funding, is that this is going to be made available to other people, also people within the countries of the project, but also outside. This is why we were trying to think in the type of output to have this online environment. So we will, if you follow us also, we will be able to have it on this. We will link it to the Child Hub platform, but also our justicewithchildren.org website. We can put it in the chat, some of these addresses, because there you'll be able to be linked in a bigger network. There will be from other countries, because this is the idea of focus, is to learn from each other. And that's why this discussion today is also to learn from each other. And then we came, that is what we say with Rebecca, and then came COVID. We just started our project in January. We were very excited. We met face-to-face in Budapest. We set up a whole plan, and then came COVID, and we said, okay, we can't meet face-to-face. We can't actually have all these events happening. So how we will need to do it online, but also how does it affect children? How can you already discuss about that? Today we don't have ideal individual assessment, so you add an additional layer of complexity in a time that no one knows exactly how to do it. So in that sense, we saw that there were various challenges for the professionals, the systems that we were trying to reach to, and so we thought that we wanted to have this conversation now today and next week, specifically on children suspect and accused of crime, and today on child victim, to think a bit about. We thought that maybe there are some practitioners that have some ideas, that have figured it out, or that have been creative enough to go and adjust their practices. How do you carry out interviews with the children when you can't meet them face to face? Can you use Zoom? Is that legal to do it? And we have lawyers now that will explain to us also some of this aspect. So that can a judge also, how can you make a decision? Can you go and jump into a process because there is this COVID? So the issue of time is also of essence here. So we were thinking that we would like this discussion also to be heard by the European Union. So we also think, since this is also money from the European Union, we thought that we could contribute to actually our common legal and policy framework, and to really see how the EU could help us sharing these practices, and use also the interesting momentum now of some of the strategies that the EC is developing on the child rights strategy that's going to be launched in the spring next year, We just launched at the European level the victims' rights strategy. There will be the strategy on sexual abuse. So all of this actually needs to be closely linked. So we can now, I want to present to you our panel that will be in this conversation, and actually start by, so I would like to quickly introduce them to you. We thought of this panel as really as the identity of focus, which is multidisciplinary. We have so different professionals involved in one way or another by working with children victim or suspects. And first, before introducing them, I just want to say a word that Olivia, which from the central CBSS, from the Council of Baltic Sea States, was supposed to be with us today, but she had the last-minute emergency. She's from the Children Unit and one of the big brains behind the Barnahus, the Promise Network in Europe. And so she really apologized and sent us her regards. So we will have today still, we are lucky enough to have representative with IFE also working with Barnahus. So we have Ife O'Malley, who is manager of the Barnahus One House Galway service in Ireland. This is a pilot site, and her role involves the coordination of interagency working within Barnahus, as well as the clinical leadership of the therapy team. So we also have Angela Vigil, who is pro bono director director of pro bono at Baker McKenzie. You are based, and we thank you very much because it's very early also where you are. You are based in the US. You are a practicing lawyer with an immense experience also in representing children in juvenile justice, child welfare, human trafficking, immigration, other areas of policy advocacy, and also a very active pro bono supporter of Terre des Hommes in Europe, and helping us also to develop a policy brief and bringing in also experiences from also the other side of the planet, and to confront a bit ideas of how it is in Europe and how it is also in the US. We have Wendy Eggman, who started her career working with several small NGOs in the Netherlands, in Latin America and Western Africa. So also very interesting experience, international experience. Wendy, you also work with the special court in Sierra Leone, where you actually took your law school. And there you worked as a volunteer for a children's rights center in Amsterdam. Today, your experience is also working more specifically with child victims or in victims' rights. Maybe there's also adults, but you have a special focus with children. And the majority of your cases are also dealt with in collaboration with Defense for Children, Netherlands, and the Ombudsman for Children. And you represent victims of severe crimes and also relative cases of murders and other similar severe crimes. So welcome to you. And we have Claudiane Gega, our colleague and of Terre des Hommes Albania, and a clinical psychologist, who you have been involved in psychological forensic issues with children of around 16 years old. So you have a very hands-on practical experience. Your activity is to accompany, to assist children during your interview session throughout all the legal proceedings, and prepare the psychological assessment for the court in both family and criminal cases. But also you're practicing psychotherapy with child victims of criminal acts and also with offenders. So you have also authored many guidelines about legal and mental health for legal and mental health professionals that work within the juvenile justice system in Albania. So I'm very, very happy to have you all here. So I would launch my first questions to you, and which will be about this impact of COVID. How, if you could say a few words about your day-to-day work, about how what challenges did you face during this COVID period in your work with the children, and how you saw it affected also the well-being of the children. So if it's okay with you, we could start with you, Ife, to tell us a few words about that.
Yes, thank you, Mariama. And thanks everybody for coming along today. So yeah, as Mariama said, I am Aoife O'Malley and I'm the manager of the Barnahus service in Galway. So just for those of you who don't know, we're an interagency service and we provide a coordinated response to child victims of sexual abuse. So I suppose we have three main functions in the Barnahus. Number one is specialist interviewing of child victims. And what we're trying to do is promote a joint interviewing approach. So you'll have a social worker and a member of the police who are specially trained to interview children, and they'll interview the child jointly. So I suppose the child protection assessment, part of the therapeutic assessment, as well as the criminal investigation, are all kind of rolled into one interview process, and that's to prevent children being re-interviewed and asked the same questions over and over again about what's happened to them. The second part, I suppose, is forensic medical examination. So we have medical examination of children, not only for their forensic needs, but we'll also provide a broader health check of where the child is at and provide intervention if needed. And the final part is therapeutic assessment and intervention as required for children. I suppose, as Mariam said, the most important part of my role really is around the interagency coordination of that response, because as we know, things work much more effectively when we all work together and we communicate well with each other. I suppose when we're moving on then to the challenges that we've experienced as a result of COVID, that has been a large aspect, I guess, of the challenges is interagency coordination. I think it's really worth noting that our service was launched in September 2019. So we've actually worked for longer in a pandemic than out of a pandemic. So our whole service has evolved as part of this pandemic, which has been a very interesting process. But it does mean that we as a team have found it really, really difficult to meet face to face, and it really doesn't happen very often for us. So that coordination piece can be really tricky. It has resulted, unfortunately, sometimes in delayed referrals, in slower responses to children, and sometimes there can be a miscommunication of information. So that's something we really have to work very hard on. But I think more importantly than any interagency work or anything like that, the impact of COVID-19 on children, I really think children have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only are children experiencing the trauma of child sexual abuse, they're living in a society that's experiencing a collective trauma. And I think we really need to be very conscious of that for children, because there's a much broader issue for them to be discussed. So I suppose there's two main areas when it comes to individual assessment that we need to be thinking about. And one of them is around risk and the other is around the voice. I don't know whether Mariam, you want to go into that detail now, or will I hang on for that?
We can, I mean, you can say in terms of the impact, and then we can come back to it just after also.
I can just provide a brief overview. I suppose there was a couple of things I was thinking of this morning that we could talk about. And like I said, number one is risk, because like I said, trauma is impacting our whole society now. So I suppose for some children that we've had through the service, they might live very close to the alleged perpetrator. And during the first lockdown here in Ireland, schools were closed. And I suppose some of these children would have perceived school to be their safe place. And unfortunately, they're living close to their perpetrator and they're not getting to go to their safe place. Obviously, their parents are extremely worried about them and distressed about the disclosures that have occurred. But also you've parents who are potentially losing their jobs, they're very stressed out themselves, their whole routine has been disrupted. We also know, I suppose, from the researchers that perpetrators are more likely to perpetrate when they experience a lot of disruption to their routine. So I suppose there's an increased risk on the children of re-victimization, and we need to be watching that. So I suppose this all impacts on the individual assessment of the child from a child protection point of view, from a therapeutic needs point of view, but also the criminal investigation process for that child. And the other area, like I said, is the voice of the child. So like I say, if the interagency process is lost, which unfortunately sometimes that does happen, you'll have particular aspects of the service that will push ahead with their piece of work. So we did have a child a while ago who disclosed sexual abuse, and the criminal investigation process kind of went on ahead before we had our interagency discussion, because I suppose the circumstances that we're living in at the moment, and it led to an awful lot of overwhelm for the child. And the child feeling very stressed, resulting in the child maybe self-harming, resulting then in everybody panicking and referring the child to lots and lots of services, which we know can sometimes do more harm than good. It's really important to hear where the child is at in that instance and what they feel like they need. So I suppose this is a child who wasn't sure she wanted to even pursue the process, but everybody was pushing ahead because everybody thought they knew what was in her best interests, rather than hearing what she had to say about things. So again, that's a huge impact on our individual assessment of where a child is at.
Thank you, Aoife, for this. And indeed, and I would like to, we can come back more specifically also about this aspect of the voice of the child in the second question that will be the follow-up after this. But before that, I'm curious to hear also from Claudiane about you, and if we hear now about this question of there is no safe place. You from, let's say, from your psychological point of view, we have indeed this risk of re-victimization, what Aoife is now mentioning, and all this aspect of well-being and what we consider in the best interest of children during this time. So how do you see that, and how, in terms of your work, do you see, can you relate to this, and do you see what has been challenging in that what the COVID you saw has had an impact on children in your work?
Thank you, Miriam. Well, as you introduced me before, my experiences with children victims of abuse or even offenders, so all those juveniles who are involved in the criminal procedure. And part of my clinical practice is to assist them during interviewing session, as well as offering psychotherapy to both these two categories of children. Well, based on my experience, I would like to talk about some practical aspects and to share with all of you some observations that I have done and based on also my discussions with some other colleagues, that how pandemic has affected the children's well-being and how the system has assisted those needs of children. I would say that it definitely has a negative impact either on children's well-being or on how the system is meeting the children's needs. Well, in terms of children's well-being, there is notice that particularly children who spend mostly their time at home due to lockdown, particularly some severe lockdown measures, they tend to have these uncertainty feelings. They experience anxiety. They experience also feelings of boredom, or some of them have also expressed feelings of low levels of affect. So this means that children are currently experiencing quite difficult emotional time period. And the pandemic has significantly affected their daily life and their lifestyle. So this is what is evidence and also what research has suggested. On the other side, not sure whether the support system is assisting those needs particularly the legal system. How is it dealing with children who are victims of domestic violence or sexual abuse, of those children who get involved in somehow in the legal system? I know this is, as you mentioned, this uncertain time. Apparently, somehow, the pandemic has affected also adults, police officers, legal officers, and apparently, when they get in touch with children, they somehow have lost their focus on how the children should be treated properly. And for example, what is noticed that when a child gets into the legal system, it has to be interviewed by the police officer. Apparently, apparently it seems that it is not given due attention to the child. It means that everything is being done in the rush. Or obviously, I will come to this point later on. But I would say that this would not be treated just as an issue of an individual, but also for the whole system, because as you mentioned, being part of a support of children that are currently experiencing an difficult emotional well-being due to a potential traumatic experience, but also under the COVID time period, which is an added stressful factor to them. So it needs to have a systematic approach, not just one-to-one assistance. So in that terms, that I see that the system is not meeting properly these category of children needs.
Okay, yes, Claudia, and this is, you're indeed reinforcing this idea and this, so I guess one of the aspects, and maybe you can come to us maybe with some examples in the after we hear also, let's say, the lawyers, the perspective now about this. What are concretely steps? Because we hear about now this aspect related to anxiety, you know, shaking into the well-being of children and how it affects their daily life. So are there some examples that you could share with the audience today about what could be done, example to support this? But we can come back to that just afterwards. I thought maybe we could hear first about, I wanted to maybe have Wendy, to when you hear this from this aspect, and now when Claudian is also mentioning about that we lose the focus on the proper process from a legal point of view. I mean, do you experience that as from your perspective as a lawyer? And if you could say a few words about your work and how you see that has impacted your work.
Okay, thank you, Mariam. Well, a lot has been said by both Eve and Claudian, which is already raising some worries when I think about what I experience in daily practice. I come in after most part of, for example, Eve's work has been done, and then I go to court or to the preparatory sessions with the kids, the child victims, when it comes to facing, for example, a suspect in court, or to talk to the prosecution. And especially in the Netherlands, I think there is a big focus on victims in general. But what I noticed, for example, there's not a really big focus on how to deal with child victims. So, for example, I am a lawyer specialized in victims' rights, and I work with them in court cases. And I happen to have experience working within children's rights. But there's, if you're someone who's just being referred, for example, by child services, to another lawyer who doesn't have that experience, you won't get any of the specialized treatments, and you might not know as much as the kids do that work with lawyers that do have experience in these fields. And I think this randomness is something that should be, probably could be stopped by the Barnehus project or something. I'm very much interested. I hope that will be implemented or something like that in the Netherlands real quickly as well, because I'd be very interested to work with that with my colleagues. And so we try to go, I think in the pre-trial phase, when you were in the police station, for example, there's special rooms for I can't come up with the word, but to listening to the child, to get their statements. But when in court, this is not so much happening anymore, and there's not much focus on difference in age between very small children and teenagers, for example. It could very well happen that I'll never meet a small child victim because they're sort of being kept away by the parents or by child protection services. And so it's very hard to make this individual assessment as a lawyer. What I would very much like is to have like a team of specialists surrounding this child, which is happening in the suspect side. It's much more common to do this, but especially focused on a victim, that's a very different story. So, for example, and then there's COVID. So when I had this experience working with children, I was able to sort of take the child to the prosecution services and bring a child protection service officer within this meeting, and all start prepare for this session that is going to be in court. I had a court session with 2 young children in 2019, and they got this full team of people surrounding them, and we tried to make an effort to prepare them for the court session. Now, next week in 2020, there's going to be the higher court session for the appeal of the suspect, and I'm not even able to bring them. We're going to be in court. We don't have Zoom meetings for court sessions, but I can't really prepare them. I can only take them there next week and show them the room, but I can't have them meet people in person. I can't prepare them. I'm going to try and talk with the prosecutor. That's the only thing I can do, but all the other people have to stay away. So this is a very harsh thing to deal with for these very young kids still that have been through big trauma. So I'm worried. I'm very much interested in maybe digital versions of the Barnehus project, and to see and hear how we can address this, because we don't know when this pandemic will be over, right?
Yeah, so thank you, Wendy. So you are pointing at the same time some, I mean, it's true, quite worrisome points, knowing that we are trying to, we think that COVID actually, we forget, or maybe we have a tendency to forget that before COVID, there was still a system that needed to be reinforced. And this is how, when we developed this idea of focus, it was to make sure that we create this interdisciplinary team. And now maybe with COVID, we are forced to even think a bit stronger about this. You are pointing out your complexities with working and not really having these interdisciplinary teams for working with child victims. So I want to refer the question to you, Angela, and maybe to give a perspective here from the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, do you relate to what Wendy is saying, or is there something that you could bring into this in terms of this aspect of the interdisciplinarity and on the challenges in really assessing the need of the victims from your perspective of a lawyer?
Sadly, I relate to all of it. It doesn't sound very different on either side. This idea of connecting children to child specialized legal counsel and legal assistance and all assistance is just gotten so much worse with COVID, partly because of the lack of resources and the imbalance of resources. You know, they say a challenge like this really shines the light on all the problems we already had. So the geographic deserts of there's resources in the cities, but you're not finding these specialized systems to address child victims and multidisciplinary systems outside of cities at all, and really leaving people behind. The other piece of it, we're finding so much, and I'm listening to this from colleagues really all over the country and all over the world, is teenagers are different, right? Teenagers and systems that address teens are different, but our systems of justice aren't. So when you're talking about teen victims, their resilience is amazing, but it also masks their pain very well. So you have teenagers that systems unintentionally sort of blame sometimes for being involved with the way that they're involved, whether it's actual victimization or just the other sometimes criminal justice issues that arise when a teenager has become part of a community where they're being victimized. And you just get a treatment of them like they're just little adults, and they don't show the pain at all. If you ask a young person involved in one of the cases that any of us are talking about to draw a picture, the first thing they're going to draw is themselves. And then they're going to draw how all the other parts of the system affect them. If you ask a court or a lawyer or a judge, they're going to draw the court and then put all the other pieces around, because it becomes court-centered rather than kid-centered, which I just so much this idea of that just makes the voice of the young person so much quieter. I think the other thing that we have to be talking about during COVID is this idea of everybody getting used to new platforms. We have, we all went under COVID and we all had kids who were in great need of therapeutic interventions in different ways. And our systems didn't adjust to that as well, but the ones that did were so much more successful. I had a client who was sitting in her bathroom in a apartment where she was surrounded by people who may or may not be some of her offenders. And she was about to take some steps that were going to hurt her dramatically. And her therapist, who couldn't come see her and was barred from coming to see her and all those other things, texted her. And all the text said was, "Are you okay?" And she said, "No," because there's a text in the middle of a traumatic moment, because texts are life when you are 14 years old. And so thinking about adjusting what we usually do in order to make sure that these services adapt to COVID and everything else 2020 has to offer seems the ticket to success. If we're not we are finding not taking as much time for things like assessments, and we should be, and there's not as many sort of that process, it just gets skipped over because we're all on Zoom and we're all uncomfortable. And it's time to let go of our own comfort and think about kid in the middle, not kid on the outside affecting it.
Yes, absolutely, Angela. So if we talk about kid in the middle, and it's a very difficult example to listen to, that this and we think that the therapists to still be able to use these technologies and to be able to support in the distance children that feel so isolated in this. So talking about child center, maybe Rebecca, do you want to say just one or two words about maybe more what is being done in Promise and the link with the needs assessment, and because around Barnahus, what also Ife explained, this is very much child-centered, that all the services go. So, but there has been challenges now also with COVID. We don't hear you, Rebecca. Yes.
Child Circle
Yes,
is a partner in Promise, and Promise is a project that is now in its third phase, and the EU has supported us all the way through and has funded us, and it's been terrific to have that kind of more long-term sustainable support to really help us build out. I am going to do an inadequate job for Olivia, who can't join us, but when we did talk a little bit before this conversation, she highlighted the fact that, of course, the Barnahus approach, which is terrific at supporting both child protection and child justice, is only as good as when we get the reports. So one of the things that the Barnahus is really talking together about is the cases that don't get reported to us. And in the pandemic in particular, you see a lot of children suffering more from violence and abuse online, or from exploitation online. And they're in an even more difficult position in terms of understanding that an abuse has happened sometimes, and then taking the steps to report it. So we're looking at how the Barnahus can, how our processes, how our individual needs assessment can factor that in to better identify and support these children, and also to better reach out. And ultimately, of course, the aim is to prevent wherever we can. So that's just one of the points Olivia had particularly signaled in relation to the pandemic.
Okay.
So that.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, for saying this. So I want to invite I see that we have a few participants in the that are with us. So please feel free to ask questions or make your comments in the chat box. I also saw that we have been joined by Annemieke, also our other in-house expert and working more specifically on restorative justice. So just to mention, Annemieke, somehow the microphones are not activated for you, I think. But if you have a question, then if it's possible, or comment to share, then we can actually relate that, because we would like to hear also a bit how it has impacted, maybe in the restorative justice processes also. And that would be very interesting to have that as part of our discussion. So I would like to invite, we will be monitoring the chat. So if you have a question directly to one of the panelists, please ask it here. Or if you have one of your experiences that you want to share with us, or a good practice to share, we would be more than happy to read it. So now what we can do is to actually move to more, let's say, in the heart of the individual needs assessments, and going again to discuss about how have professionals today with this during the COVID pandemic, how have they been able to engage with children and each other to undertake this individual assessment, so that they could still fulfill with their own responsibilities? What were the challenges, and can we identify some learning, silver lining? So we got some example now already given by some of you, by the way that to approach from a psychological point of view, from a legal point of view. So now I would like to ask maybe if some of you could elaborate a bit further about this idea and giving us some concrete examples. So maybe we could go back now to Angela. About, you were mentioning in our preparatory discussions about what you saw in terms of distinctions between older and younger children, and if you could elaborate a bit more about also the digital aspect of it, and the right to speak and also not to speak, because that also caught our attention. So we will be happy to hear about that.
For sure. Well, if there is a silver lining, I don't know if you could say that about COVID-19, it is that where jurisdictions have chosen to go to online programs and virtual court systems, it has surprised us, I think, to see that you know, young people live in these little boxes that the rest of us are getting used to, and they live on their phones and their TikToks and everything. So many of them are in a way more comfortable participating in the proceeding if invited and allowed, especially in a proceeding that has to do with, you know, where they're, what is going to happen to them as a result of being a victim. So I'm finding clients who are more comfortable because they don't have to walk into a foreign court room, and they don't have to walk past offenders, and they don't have to walk past system advocates even who may be well-intentioned, but they see as perhaps judging of them, to be able to, in this setting, just like we are doing right now, perhaps be a little bit more comfortable asserting what they would like to see and what has happened to them, and sort of enunciating that in a space that's more comfortable. So it's something to learn from, that a generation that lives here. But the other piece of this from a lawyer's perspective for victims is to keep in mind this idea that under so many different jurisdictions, including the European Commission Justice Guidance document, including the this idea that a legally false one, they have the right to participate, but they don't have the obligation to participate in. So I'm happy to throw it out there and
I don't know if you have it. Sorry,
my colleagues on the panel show.
Oh, I think we have there was just a problem. Yeah, we couldn't hear the last part. I think the others couldn't either. Was it just me? Maybe could you try again, just to repeat the last part of what you were sharing?
Yes, just an emphasis that a lot of legal frameworks, including the guidelines of the Committee on Ministers of the Council of Europe on Child-Friendly Justice, government guidelines to the EC, have talked about don't have an obligation to participate.
Yes.
They have an opportunity to participate and a right to participate. And sometimes, and I say that lightly, hoping my colleagues on the panel can hear me and critique it, because it is sometimes not consistent with the best interest of the child. But as lawyers in the system, leaders, it's very important.
No, I think that we have maybe
keep in the system that process, and that takes time, and we don't always have it. Let me stop because I think I'm having sound trouble.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Angela. Just it was difficult to understand it. The sound is breaking out now. But I think from what I've understood also, that you're trying to get also the colleagues' opinion about what, or maybe we could refer to Wendy, and then also to Claudiane, so we could have a lawyer and a psychologist giving their point of view, which is about the right maybe not to participate. So yes, with the right not to participate, exactly. So is that something that, is it something quite audacious to say today? Because now we are saying we don't hear enough the voices of children in criminal proceedings. But what if the child actually doesn't want to speak? Can you actually oblige it? Is that in the best interest? So have you had cases like this, and you know, within this period also, where it's actually difficult also to reach out to the children? So maybe Wendy, do you want to say a word about that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it makes me. Well, Angela invited us to critique this point of view as well, but obviously, largely, I agree with this. I mean, you can't have a child-centered court session or a child-centered proceedings if you don't put the best interest of the child first, and then if you don't listen to the child, how do you put the child's best interest first? But at the same time, you know, once the proceedings have started, it might be very hard to sort of not have the child participate, because being the victim, it's very important to have their voice heard or represented by someone to be able to prosecute someone. So it all depends on the goals as well. If you want to take, for example, preventative measures against perpetrators, or you need to, and you want to take the law as a starting point, and you wanted to use the criminal proceedings to prevent crimes and to do justice to these child victims, and how could you not have them participate in these proceedings? You need their voices, either through the police enforcement that have talked to them before, or through their parents, or to other representatives. At the same time, there's different stages in our court system. I think that's quite similar to other ones, where you can participate. I mean, when you start, I have to say, it also depends on the age of the child, of course. I mean, it's a very big difference to have to involve a child that's 2 or 3 years old in comparison to a teenager. A teenager will be much easier to be able to express what their needs are, or at least to talk about this with a professional that's involved in the court sessions. However, if you get involved, there's still several steps you can take. I mean, it means that you can talk about what happened to you and make statements about it. That doesn't mean necessarily that you also have to show up in court and be confronted with the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. But there's also a right to speak your voice and use the right to speak in courts. So I think there is possibilities to make it as individual as possible for the children, and we all need to make sure that we put the child first, the victim first, and not the courts in the center of the focus, like Angela said when she was talking about the drawing. If we do this, if we keep focused, if we keep communicating with the kids and the people that are surrounding the kid, I think we could do a very good job. I see Annemiek is saying something. Maybe I have to address. I'm not sure. I can't see it yet.
I will. We will. So we will actually. I see Rebecca. You asked to speak. So maybe just before we go to Claudia, and I was wondering if also you might have also some reactions to this. I want to share before what in the chat. So Annemiek is saying that indeed restorative justice. So can indeed be an important tool in relation to child justice, both for suspect and child victims. Also within these systems, more often forms of individual assessment are used to see what restorative justice form would fit, if it is safe, and what the specific needs of what the specific needs of the child are. So here is to see indeed, and unfortunately, unless there's a way to use the microphone for Annemiek, to elaborate this further. That here this is to actually to see how we can address this through restorative justice. But maybe Rebecca, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just a comment going back to both Angela and Wendy's point, and relating it back maybe to the situation we're in now in COVID. I mean, if in some cases there is a risk that the criminal investigation and the court proceedings are prolonged, of course, one of the big things that the Barnahus tries to do, in accordance with the EU law, is record the interview with the child. And just as Wendy said, maybe avoid the child having to go to court, that this is produced as testimony in the court. And obviously one has to do that in a way that respects the rights of the defence entirely. And the Barnahus project is all about making sure those rights are met while the children's situation is addressed. And I remember being really, really struck by a point that was made in a Scottish review, which was that if you record the child giving their testimony and you show that in court, what the court sees, and where there's a jury system, what the jury sees is the child as the child was at the time of the offence. So they see the child. They don't see 2 years down the line, maybe a much older child. They can relate much more easily to what actually happened to the child, and not potentially is someone who afterwards may or may not have been in trouble with the law, has difficulties, etc. So in any event, potentially the pandemic, to the extent that it can really encourage people to record the interview in a timely way, ahead of the proceedings, and use that, that would be a silver lining, as you were saying. But I think Claudian probably has more to say in relation to that as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Claudian, do you want to react, or to does it generate thoughts in you, and also about where's the line between respecting the law and wanting to gather evidence in order to build your case, and then making sure that you protect the rights of the children and you don't become a bit pushy, let's say, in a way, so that you can find it. And this is where I think also in Focus, in Promise, this project also looking at building the capacity of the practitioners to know, to also identify when is it that you go too far, or what are also the, for instance, like recordings, these opportunities to be able to still gather your evidence, but then in a safe way for children. So Claudian, what would you like to
Well, thank you. That's a lifetime challenge, actually, because it's a very tricky, it's a very complex process. And the question is not to say or not to say the opinion from the part of the child. The question is how to create the right context for a child to express himself properly. So, and that is a tricky thing. So it is due to the all the legal system and all the legal professionals and mental health professionals to create the proper context for a child, a victim, or even offender to confess or talk or have his say or yes, express his opinion in a proper way, because it's a very challenging and very difficult experience for a child. Let's get back to I would like to get back to the point of how pandemic is affecting this very significant process, such as let's say, an interviewing process of a child, or a child victim of the sexual abuse or domestic violence. Now, the interviewing process is a quite complex process, and it has various components. Like first is a pre-interview talk with the child in order to let's say to make the child aware of what is going to do in the interviewing session, who is going to ask him, what questions are going to be about. Then is the first phase, then the middle phase, and the final phase of the interview. And what is crucial in this process is time. So all of these steps of an interviewing process need the due time. What is evidenced now during the pandemic is that professionals, legal professionals, police officers are not giving the right time to each of these components of the interviewing process. What does this mean? This means that, let's say that if you have a child who is potentially abused, which is probably suffering not a usual emotional state, under COVID timing, which we have already mentioned some of the psycho-emotional impact that COVID is having on children. Now, this child is going to face an interview into a legal process, which is a stressful factor per se for the child. Now, we have a quite difficult situation here, and we want to get the right information from the child, but not re-victimizing the child. Now, that's a tricky thing. And if we don't give the right time to each of these components of an interview, we might risk to re-victimize, unwillingly re-victimize the child. And so what has to be done? Yes, this is a very easy, actually, from my perspective, is an easy practical thing, that the attention should get back to children. The process needs to be done properly, even in the time of COVID. And
but you as a practitioner, so if you are pressured to actually do this, so how, if you are being rushed, so do you have actually, as a practitioner in the process, the time to take the time?
Unfortunately, that if a practitioner is under rush, well, it depends on case basis, actually, but if practitioner is under pressure, obviously he's not going to do his job properly, because it's not the time that practitioner needs, but the time that child needs. First, for example, if you don't give the right time to build a relationship with the child, he's not very willing to share confidential and very sensitive and painful information to someone. And one of the aspects of pandemic is increase the feelings of uncertainty to children. Now, if we add this to the certainty that comes with involvement in the legal process, now we have even a worsened situation. So time seems to be a crucial aspect of this process, allowing the child to get a relationship, to build a relationship with the interviewer, and then tell his story on his own words, and then receive the message from the interviewer that he is interested in his own story and he is willing to hear and support him throughout all the legal proceedings. If the child does not receive this message, then it's very hard for the child to confess very sensitive information.
Okay, yeah, so do you think, if I go to you, Aoife, to respond a bit to what Claudian is saying, and this maybe isn't then the idea of this, if we would implement properly this multidisciplinarity, and then maybe we would explain that maybe that how to deal with lack of time would be if all the professionals in the process will understand that time is needed to build that relationship with children, or what Claudian has just expected. So maybe this interdisciplinary setting would help to address this, no? Or what do you think?
Absolutely. Sorry, Claudia, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. So I think that that it will certainly be a positive factor. It will contribute significantly on a positive way in this process, because if everyone is aware that the process should be done properly, that the needed time needs to be given to a child, and time to do any component of the interview properly is crucial, to understand first whether the child is willing to share this information, or to create the right context of the child to disclose sensitive and painful, I would say, information. Yes. So the time is, I picked up this. There are various aspects that are not being done properly under this pandemic time. But I choose this component as this is like such a, I consider it to be a fundamental aspect to create the right context for a child to express, to understand whether he wants, first to understand whether he wants to say what he wants to say, and to express himself properly or herself properly to someone, to an interviewer that he doesn't know. Perhaps it's a police officer or a social worker, but the child meets for the first time. And so, and there is also this feeling of uncertainty of what's going to happen after, what's going to happen. So this feeling of a positive approach and attention that child should receive, it's crucial to the interviewing process.
So that right attention and the right space, Aoife from in Ireland, what do you think about that? So how would you like to contribute?
I completely agree. And I suppose just to draw on some of the points that both Claudian and Angela have made. First of all, I suppose to Angela's point about the right to say no, our focus is children, and our focus is their best interests and their needs, I suppose, particularly in the Barnahouse. So the right to say no and hearing that will support recovery, and that's what we're about, is supporting recovery. That's primary, I suppose, to the secondary goal of catching the bad guys, and that's something that we very much agreed on when we set up the Barnahouse. Catching the bad guys is secondary. Primarily, we need to focus on the needs of children. Second of all, I suppose, again, drawing on what Claudia was saying about time and time pressures, really, again, our role in the Barnahouse is to get best evidence. And in order to get best evidence, we need to give time and move at the pace of the child. Because otherwise, what's the point in putting any time if we're not getting best evidence and the best information from that child? Because that child will feel coerced. You know, they'll feel re-victimized potentially as well, likely will feel re-victimized by being pushed into a particular situation. And we're doing no good to anyone, because we're not positively affecting the child's experience. We're also not catching the bad guys if we're not getting best evidence, you know. So I think we need to manage both of those things. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you, Aoife. So really, this question of time seems to trigger also some comments in the chat. So we have Kieran Campbell, who makes a comment to say, excellent point, Claudia, and that time is essential, and it is the child's time that should be the determining factor, not the practitioner's time. So how can we ensure that in this moment we keep that all the professionals involved have that clear in mind? And also Angela, who is mentioning time. Yes, maybe now in the time of COVID, there should be in a way more time, since there are fewer logistics, less travels and others. So all disciplines have to talk about how we need more times if we want to get systems to change the schedules. And we have Eva from the Netherlands. Hi, Eva, who say that law enforcement is now obliged between inverted commas to conduct an individual assessment in a form before the child reports the crime. The main goal is to prevent re-victimization by the offender suspect. The results will not be part of the criminal file. The assessment itself is very limited. Is it necessary to report the crime anonymously? Is an area or contact then necessary? For instance, are measures necessary to keep the child safe? And they have 7 minutes to carry this out. So we were indeed, Eva is mentioning that to address this, only 7 minutes to do this. So here we are way far from actually taking sufficiently the time to explain such a complex process and making the child to feel safe in the process. So I think, Eva, you are actually also sharing quite concerning piece of information with us.
Mariam, is it possible for me to say something?
Yes,
about
please,
this?
Wendy. Yes.
I'm just because, well, I see this heading towards quite a, I don't want to call it an obvious point, like we need more time, we need more focus, we need more energy going towards the child victim. At the same time, if we're looking into criminal proceedings, and that's what we're talking about, that's a very complex process. There might be, the suspect might also be a minor. You'll talk about that next week, but there's also, for example, or perhaps other victims that could be children as well involved. And so if we're taking, I think there's also has to be a balance between taking your time with this one individual child, of course, and being very careful not to re-victimize them. But at the same time, there's others, other aspects involved that needs to be addressed as well. So also when it comes to what Angela said about the right to saying no, yes, I cheer for that. And at the same time, I'm very much worried when it comes to networks of pedophiles, for example, or like when there's more children in one family. How do you address that then if you we keep it heading this way, like, yes, that's perfect, take more time. You understand what I mean, what I'm trying to say? Maybe there could be a reaction to that as well, because that worries me a bit as well.
Yeah, so how is the balance between this pressure to actually have it, being able to advance in your proceeding and then the actual time? Aoife, is there something there from your experience that you can share? And I know you have, some tools, and then after Claudiane, maybe to also have a reaction.
Yeah, I can definitely hear Wendy's point, and I absolutely recognize that. I suppose I think, again, going back to my point about really having a clear definition of what the role of your service is. I think it's worth noting that in our service, the gathering of evidence happens in Barnahus, but the actual investigation, be it through investigating the substantiation of what the child has said, so looking at maybe the risk to other children from a child protection perspective, the risk of the perpetrator to other children, or looking at a criminal investigation process. Those things happen outside of Barnahus, so it's not our current focus, but I absolutely recognize that it is somebody's focus and it is something that's really, really important. But I think it's about that definition, I think, of what your focus is and being quite specialist in that. And like I say, if we can get best out evidence, then we're giving the best thing that we can to the investigation process.
Okay, thank you. And Claudiane, you wanted to add to this?
Yes. I completely agree with this, with the balance of time. But it is a very tricky thing, actually, when it comes to daily practice with children, because let's say if we push too much the child, we also risk not to have accurate information. We also risk to suggest the child to say something that we might want to know, because the process needs to go on fast and because the perpetrator should be captured. But we might risk not to have accurate information on that. So that is, when we talk about time, it's not abusing with time, but giving the right time to a child to confess accurate information. And it depends on, if it's on a case basis, that not every child needs more time to say that by giving the time, we give a message that, okay, we're here to understand you, to help you, to support you, and we have all our attention to you. So that's the one of the aspects when we say time, the right time to a child.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Claudia. And so maybe, Rebecca, you want to react, and then we can actually move to the question about looking towards the future and maybe some suggestion. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe bridging between the two now. I mean, we hear about the importance of time and the importance of planning and the issues of that COVID creates for both of those elements. Time, which seems both short and long in COVID times, and planning, which in some ways we should be better at, but in some ways we can be more, we can find more difficult. A lot of that is human error. But it's also about tools, having the tools available. So for example, in the Barnahus, there are interagency protocols precisely, for example, to address the issue of confidentiality of data. So if you're bringing services together, that we preserve the confidentiality of the data and use it in an appropriate way. So one could imagine having a Zoom call with all the different services represented, but you could really only do that safely if we're all clear about what data we can share. I take very to heart the point that Wendy makes. It's of course, we're deeply concerned with children, but we are deeply concerned with the rights of the defendant as well. And so how do we preserve that? And time is a massive issue in that, because if you record a child's interview, and if you have the lawyer for the defense able to question the child, not maybe directly, but through an interviewer, that questioning should happen at a time when you have all the other investigative information that's relevant. So for example, have the police released phone records? Has the lawyer had access to certain important facts which they may need to the child? So planning carefully that all the steps happen in the right way is clearly important and more challenging, but also maybe more possible, or that it can be better planned if we use these tools. So looking to the future, hopefully, as Angela said, we have the platforms, can we use them?
Yes, exactly. And Annemieke is adding to this also that they need time planning and also indeed the multidisciplinarity, cooperation, and actually really understanding how it is to work together. So if we look now towards the future, so if we want to see how can we promote the progress and looking at better outcomes for children, we are talking about the right for children to participate. So how, if we assess the needs of children, obviously we need to hear, to talk with them. This is not just a form to fill. This is actually a conversation or a series of conversations with children. In this case, child victims, that we will try to avoid as much as possible to have them to repeat their story all over. And we have heard today about some ways to avoid having to repeat the story, maybe what technology allows us also to do it, like keeping distance sometimes when it's needed, or having something recorded. But do we actually, and this maybe also referred to a bit what Angela was saying, like children actually need to understand also the implication of what they are saying. So are we, when we are looking at assessing their needs, and do we include in this also that we really properly explain to them what is the implication of this, and what do you think we could do to better listen to children? And maybe if we are in the Promise, and you are quite active also in the child participation working group, and what do you think about this one, having a bit more space for children would that help us to actually better understand what we would need to do as practitioners to be able to carry this assessment in a better way in these challenging times?
That's fine. Do you want me to go first?
Yes, you can go first. Yes, go ahead.
That's great. I suppose, yeah, there's a couple of huge pieces of learning from the COVID pandemic, and I think it's very much supported by the Promise project. Number one is that child participation aspect. I think if there's a culture of participation, and it's not actually just children, it's definitely about hearing what the voices of, or what children have to say, but it's also who are they influencing, who's listening to those voices. And do those voices actually have an impact? And we talk a lot in the working group about avoiding tokenism when it comes to child participation. It's very important that we have a meaningful conversation with where children are at. And I do really think that if we have that culture in a service, then we are actually saving time, because people go in expecting to be heard. So they're much more likely to let their voices be heard if that culture already exists. So that I can say that's something that's very well supported by the Promise Project. And again, I know I'm always talking about it, but interagency working is just so important. Having multiple eyes on a child and a situation is really important. One is with points that keeps coming into my head as people are talking, and it's just a very practical thing that we've introduced, is that our referrals meetings, or the original plan was to have them weekly, and now they're twice weekly. So really we're seeing cases very quickly once they come into the system. We're discussing them as an interagency team as quickly as we possibly can, and we're making a plan from there. So while we might be giving more time to interviewing the child and hearing what they have to say, we're spending less time worrying about administration, referrals, making sure people know about the case, information sharing and so on. So it's really finding that balance between the two. And again, there are two areas that are really supported by the Promise Project, and we've learned an awful lot from our colleagues in Europe about that.
Oh, thank you, Aoife. And I think that going into direction, I mean, we are always, I mean, as Stadism, we are always quite surprised, even though we implement, we have several what we call child participation methodologies, and you know, talking about this time of COVID, I need to actually mention this big initiative, the COVID Under-19, that actually was led by one of my colleagues, and where we actually asked children. And it was actually really a child-led initiative, and they had a lot to say. There's now more than over thousands of children that participated and were asked about their needs, and so there will soon, by the way, by the end of the month, be some of the results there. So there is actually a lot to learn by actually really hearing this and seeing how we can actually improve our work. I would like to say, maybe, do you want Rebecca to mention a point related to that, or maybe what you think in terms of also we're talking again about the role of the European Union in this, and if you see some link.
Yeah, I mean, Mariama, you mentioned at the outset that there are a lot of strategies coming out from the Commission at the moment that can help us. And that we can feed into, all of us collectively. I mean, the victims' rights strategy, of course, is one. And specifically in the strategy, they said they wanted to learn about COVID challenges and really focus in on that. The Commission is also consulting on the children's rights strategy at the moment. And participation of children is one of their big priorities. Child justice is a priority, and within that, of course, multidisciplinarity is something that the Commission quite audaciously pushed for in their integrated child protection recommendations and principles several years ago. And I think, of course, when we come down to it, I mean, COVID has made us all able to come to meetings like this and look at each other in our little boxes and be together in our same room. And that's a massive thing for us all to do. I remember Aoife was saying, you know, now she can go to Sweden in the morning to kind of find something out very quickly, or to Donegal. Both are beautiful destinations. But also, we had a meeting within Focus, where we had in one of our squares were the children coming to talk to us, and was a young man who had been convicted at 16, and who was still in jail years later, got a sentence of 15 years. And from the square, he said, he shared his experience, but also turned to us and said, by the way, what are you all going to do? What's your project going to achieve for us? And I look at Mariama and Sylvia and Mika, we were all on the call, and we all went, you know, that is so motivating. I mean, we are going to do something. We'll be back to you. We'll see you again. So, you know, I mean, again, these are the things that hopefully, you know, across Europe, and even reaching out to Thanksgiving America, you know, we can do that. Thanks again, Angela, by the way.
Yes, and Rebecca, Angela, you want to say something?
I just wanted to echo that, and with two quick ideas, which was this culture of feedback. teenagers are now very much in a culture of feedback. If they don't like something, they go on Yelp and they say they don't like it. If they're on TikTok and they don't like something that they just heard from another person, they react. But I think we need to do two things. One, we need to do this great involvement of young people in developing systems, but two, we have to figure out how to embolden this culture of feedback while it's happening. You have to say to a child while we're working through a court system, what did you think of what that caseworker just said? And have, when I have done this and gotten asked for feedback from my clients, they will say, I think you called me stupid. Like you talking about I needed help in school, and what I heard is you called me stupid, right? That kind of feedback will make me a better, advocate and listener, but it has to be okay to do it in between our disciplines. I have to be able to say to the social worker, by the way, I talked to this young person who said you had done this, and we all have to be okay with it, because later reflections by people who used to be in the system, very valuable. But real-time reflections, which can't be as formal and have to be in between all of the damage that can be done, can be just completely transformative.
Yes, how it's really fascinating, and to contribute to this, I'm actually asking children to participate. I see also in the comments, Annemiek mentioned that indeed there is now a project ongoing in partnership with Restorative Justice Netherlands, the European Forum on Restorative Justice, Terre des Hommes, that looks at restorative justice and child victims, where there's child advisory boards that are the group of children being asked about different processes there, and also about their needs, so that their needs can be met. And Silvia Randazzo is actually mentioning also the aspect of digitalization, and saying that she very much like Angela, you saying about how comfortable children are online. And maybe it is exactly a good moment for all of us, adults, professionals, practitioners, to adapt to children, that we basically might have an opportunity to finally learn how to communicate using the tools children actually prefer. And this Michael van Aswegen, sorry if I misspell your name, I agree, Sylvia, from a therapeutic perspective, speaking the language of the child is so important. As adults, the challenge for some of us is understanding only really the technology. So there is definitely a lot to learn. And as we are approaching, Rebecca, the end of of this very dynamic conversation, and I think we obviously didn't solve anything, but at least we reflected on some points. And I hope that for the focus partners, we can you have actually more fruitful thoughts to be able to develop the mutual learning. Maybe Rebecca, do you want to say a few closing words? Or yes?
I mean, only very briefly, and also to flag that next week, as we've said already, we'll be looking at children who are accused or suspects. So, encouraging you to join as well. Wendy was very interesting, of course, that often cases concern both a child victim and a child suspect and accused. So I really just wanted to emphasize that. And to say that, as Sylvia mentioned, we will have a mutual learning paper at the end of Focus. The project ends next year. We have another year. We're delighted. We're going into a pilot process at the beginning of next year. And again, we'll learn more about the realities of COVID in day-to-day practice. So we'll share that with you all, and look forward to keeping in touch, and invite you to contact us if a point comes up. Thanks.
Yes, so indeed, so this is really a series of discussions that we are having. We wanted this, so this really the series of 2 webinars, and we can use of what we discussed today next week with the discussion that will be a bit more focused with child suspects. So we really invite all of you that are participating today to also register. There is another link on Child Hub. You will receive it. So please share it further in your social media to have even more people participating. And we would like to also see that please continue to follow us on, we have, TDH, the Partners, Child Circle. I see here we have Petya from Bulgaria. Also, we have different Facebook pages where we share a lot of the information about the project. And also this, let's say this online environment, we would like to really have different practitioners participating, sharing. This is really to learn from each other. And the only way to do that is to hear everyone's voices. So this is how we actually continuously learn. So I would like to really say thank you. So on behalf of the whole, let's say, Focus family, because we consider ourselves as a family, Thank you to very warmly to Aoife, to Claudiane, to Wendy, to you know, Rebecca, Sylvia, Angela, again on Thanksgiving Day, to be with us and to have contributed to this very rich discussion that we will surely take further into the focus project. We will keep you informed about the different developments, and yes, and we hope that yeah, if you have questions, you can reach out to us. I mean, our colleague Orinda, who is the project coordinator for Focus, is also one of the contact points. You see her now on the screen, so please do not hesitate also to reach out to her if you have questions, and we are more than happy to answer to you. So thank you very much, and thank you, Rebecca, for for leading this with me also today, and thank you to Tamas, to Child Hub also for all this, the background, the technological aspect, to make sure that we could have a meeting today online all together. So take care, everyone, be safe, and see you next week. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mariama. Bye.
Bye.